Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very respected and accomplished professional from Florida, USA, Mr. Jeffrey Korzenik. Jeffrey, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Jeffrey is a chief economist and an author. He's an author of a book titled Untapped Talent, How Second Chance Hiring Works for Your Business and the Community. And he's a regular guest on CNBC, Fox Business News, and Bloomberg TV. So, Jeffrey, before we start talking about your book, tell me about your own amazing journey in brief.
Well, I come from what in the United States would be considered an upper middle class family that highly valued education. My father, who was deceased in 2003, but a big influence on my life, was first in family to go to college, but he did it in style. Harvard undergrad, Harvard Law School, Yale Law School degrees. So no pressure on the children. I went to Princeton. Always had an interest in finance. Actually couldn't get a job in the industry coming out of college.
Wow.
And so worked for a British company for a year, and then was able to go to Wall Street in New York City and joined a company called E.F. Hutton, a company which was a legendary company that only lasted about 18 months after I joined. And I was acquired time and time again and had a long Wall Street career. Did a little bit of entrepreneurial, joining small companies, trying to do startups, and went back to a larger bank in 2009 when I joined Fifth Third Bank, which is my current employer. And I became chief economist, the bank's first chief economist in their 165-year history last year, after a number of related roles.
Wow. So let's now talk about your book. The book is titled Untapped Talent, How Second Chance Hiring Works for Your Business and Community. And before I ask you a question, I'm going to ask all our viewers and listeners to go and check out Mr. Jeffrey Korzenik's book on Amazon. I will do the same thing. So my first question to you, Jeffrey, is what inspired you to write Untapped Talent and focus on second chance hiring? And how do you define second chance?
Sure. Let me start with the definition. Second chance hiring is the intentional hiring of people with criminal records.
Okay.
And this is a big issue in the United States because we have an enormous number of people with criminal records. Depending on the count and how you count it, it's upwards of 70 million people, which is about a third of our working age, of our adult population. And historically, they have been shunned from the workforce, either not employed, not able to get a job, or only able to get a very low-level job and not move up and contribute to the full extent of their capability. My journey in this direction really started over a decade ago when American economists were very concerned with our falling labor force participation rate. A smaller and smaller percentage of our adult population was actually in the workforce. And most economists eventually sort of shrugged their shoulders and just accepted it. We put in a new number on our models. And I kept asking why. And I came to the conclusion back around 2014 that three social ills were of such a magnitude this century that they were causing problems with our workforce. Long-term unemployment, the terrible opioid epidemic that is a real issue in the United States, probably greater than any other developed country. And then finally, having been impacted by the justice system, having a criminal record. And as I began exploring this, I stumbled into employers who actually figured out, how do you bring people off the sidelines who have this background? And as I started collecting the stories of these employers, I realized that there was a model for success. And I wanted to share that model of success. And the book became the best way to leverage my time. And by 2019, I had flown. In 2019, I flew 141 flight segments, and I couldn't get on another airplane to spread the message. So a book became a great way to spread the message.
Incredible. Wow. So my next question is, what are some of the common misconceptions employers have about second chance hiring, and how does your book address these challenges?
Sure. There are essentially three misconceptions. One, that it's dangerous. You're putting a risk and that there's no way to separate out who's a risk to your business or not. Number two, there's a perception that people with criminal records can't do quality work. And number three, there's a misconception that it will somehow hurt your business's reputation if you become known for hiring people with a criminal record. And the book and my work and the models that others have developed really show that these are falsehoods. They have to be raised. You can't dismiss them. They are very real issues. With regard to risk overall in your business, you're not hiring everyone. You have a process for screening. The process, incidentally, in my view, is very much dependent on character. And can you find people of good character? And it turns out there's a process relying on nonprofits or other entities that can effectively provide a character attestation. And when you do it right, selectively hiring and then supporting appropriately, and that's a real key to this, is understanding the needs of people who come out of deep poverty, have not had a good track record of work in their families. How do you have to support them? When you do that, you not only get high quality work, you get a very dedicated employee, and low turnover is really important to business profitability. And then finally, with reputation, I think reputation concerns are very old fashioned. At least in the US, consumers and other companies want to do business with companies that are doing social good. And there are few examples of social good that are better than turning around this intergenerational poverty, giving people who, yes, have made a mistake, but have paid for that mistake, giving them a second chance.
Fascinating. Thank you for all the amazing work you're doing for people who deserve a second chance. My next question, Jeffrey, is, in your book, you talk about a business case for second chance hiring. Can you give me some of the salient points?
The number one business case is businesses have no choice but to look for talent where they have overlooked it in the past. Across the world, India included, fertility rates are falling. India still has a fertility rate above replacement rate, so it's still growing its native-born population. But in the US, we have fallen to record low levels of fertility. And if it were not for immigration, we couldn't even replace our population. And even at least with legal immigration, traditional immigration, at this point, we're not going to be able to replace our population. So the problem with that is that your working age population as a percentage of your overall population is shrinking. And so people who retire in the US after World War II, we had something called the baby boom generation, a very, very fertile period in American demographics. And that generation is retiring, and there simply aren't enough workers. But when baby boomers retire, they're still consumers. They still need goods and services. And now we have this structural workforce shortage that is going to get progressively worse over the next decade or more. The population of people with criminal records, second chance employees, is so large and so overlooked that employers can no longer ignore that.
Wow. And how has the perception of second chance hiring changed among businesses since your book was published?
It has improved. I'm not sure the improved perception and attitude has translated into enormous advances, but it's getting there. This is a process. I was fortunate around the time the book came out. One of America's more prominent CEOs, Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase Bank, the largest financial institution in the United States, came out in favor of this very publicly. They also hire people with criminal records, fairly low-level offenses. Jamie Dimon, as well as Craig Arnold, the CEO of Eaton Corp, a power management company, formed what's called the Second Chance Business Coalition. It's now up to 50 member corporations. These are among America's largest corporations, and they have all endorsed this concept. So that's really helped. And then there's nothing like, it said necessity is the mother of invention.
Correct.
The labor shortage got quite acute during the pandemic. One of our regional Federal Reserve banks estimated that in the first 18 months of the pandemic, in addition to all the older generation we expected to retire, an additional 2.4 million retired earlier than expected. So this labor shortage that should have kind of come about gradually became very acute, and it's still acute today. So that's really helping the reception of these ideas.
Amazing. My next question for you, Jeffrey, is that, while everything you've told me so far has been for very large companies, this is the age of small and medium enterprises, startups. How can small businesses start implementing second chance hiring practices? And what is the process of vetting?
It's interesting because I did just focus in our conversation on large companies, but my book focuses almost exclusively on small and medium-sized enterprises.
Okay.
Because, as you know, they can be much more nimble, and they're just better risk takers in a lot of ways. So the pioneers that I've studied that really are the subject of the book are small and medium enterprises. Their vetting process typically relies on outside partners. In the US, we have a very large nonprofit community, many of whom are dedicated to workforce development and to serving the specific needs of people with a criminal record, or especially those coming out of prison. And they get to know the candidates that work with them. They're what they consider their clients. And they can do the type of character attestation to say to an employer, this individual is ready. They are committed to rebuilding a better life, not going back to a life of crime, and being good citizens, good members of the community. So there's a very heavy reliance on nonprofits. They also typically rely on nonprofits for support mechanisms for their employees. People coming out of prison, in particular in the US, often lose their driver's license when they're in prison. They have trouble with housing, the regulatory restrictions and public housing. They need a lot of other kinds of support. And nonprofits also partner with these small and medium-sized businesses to provide those supports. Not free, it's not expected to be free. In turn, those companies often make donations, provide other forms of support, but it is a very, very successful model.
Fascinating. And based on all the research that you have done for your book, and I'm sure after that as well, is there any data to establish that second chance hires tend to stay longer, work better, or any other similar parameters?
There are a great number of what I'll call micro studies. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of widespread academic work. Part of the problem is you can't look at the population as a whole. You have to look at the model of success. So you really have to study the companies that are doing it the right way and look at their experience. The fact that they keep doing it again and again tells you it's working for them. But some of the companies have come up with some very good statistics and show that their rates of turnover, say in high turnover industries, are a fraction of traditional. There's one company that was featured prominently in the book, Nehemiah Manufacturing, a consumer goods manufacturer in Cincinnati, Ohio. Small company, about 200 odd employees. Roughly 70% of their workforce is second chance. Harvard Business School did a case study of them in 2018. There are more case studies. I was part of what's probably the single most comprehensive case study of any employer, a small company also in Ohio called JBM Packaging. It was conducted by a nonprofit, did the case study. So it's growing. And while I wish there were more widespread, large-scale studies, I think it's meaningful that all of these smaller studies point in the same direction.
Mhm.
You do this the right way, you get an employee who's not average, but is actually exceptionally engaged and loyal.
Well said. And how would second chance hiring contribute to community development and societal improvement?
In the US, this is, I think, a critical pathway. As I'm sure your listeners know, we have some racial divides in the United States, and these extend in economic measures, but often the causal factor is criminal justice involvement. And we have the reality in the US, what we distinguish, I should add for your listeners, between low-level crimes, which are called misdemeanors, and more serious crimes, which are called felonies. 1 in 3 Black men in America has a felony conviction. It's a staggering number. And what this has caused with the difficulty of re-entering the workforce, rebuilding economically when you have a felony conviction, it's caused intergenerational poverty. And so to mime, and of course, you perpetuate criminal activity in some of these neighborhoods, particularly if a father who made a mistake in his youth can't rebuild his life. It's often not present for the family, the sons, and sometimes the daughters, but the sons typically seek out gang life as an alternative, and you perpetuate this cycle. The way to break this cycle in American society is give the fathers who are ready and who have earned the right for a second chance by showing their remorse for a crime, commitment to rebuilding a life, to give them a second chance, and then you break this intergenerational cycle.
Amazing. And how would employers address the concerns of existing employees about working alongside individuals with either a misdemeanor or a felony?
One outcome of the widespread opioid epidemic is that most families in the United States know someone who has a criminal record. And so it's become so widespread, it has helped break down some of the us versus them barriers that have historically existed. I mean, that's a terrible, terrible fact, but it is a reality. And perhaps that's a little bit of I can't even say a silver lining because the opioid epidemic is so tragic, but it might be one positive aspect of it. I always stress to employers that you're never talking about compromising workplace safety. You are doing a very thorough vetting, and it usually helps if employers position this in a broader context of people needing a second chance, not specific to having a criminal record. So for instance, Kroger stores, the largest grocery store in the United States with roughly 400,000 employees, they have something called the New Beginnings program, and it is focused on their warehouse work, so it's not necessarily customer facing, and it's not just people with criminal records, it's anyone in need of a second chance. People who have been homeless, people who have recovered from addiction, and yes, even people whose pathway led them to a criminal record and who have paid their dues. So when you position it within that framework, I think everyone can look back on their own life and say, yeah, someone gave me a second chance. Maybe it had nothing to do with the crime, but someone gave me a second chance. And I also think that the reason this works is really human nature, and you can appeal to that. All of us have at one point made a mistake in our lives and fallen down and been less than the person we want to be. This crowd is no different. When people of character, and there's lots of people of character who've made mistakes that resulted in criminal records, pick themselves up, redouble their efforts to prove that they are more than their worst mistakes. And so when you position it that way, which is the appropriate positioning, I think you can overcome a lot of those fears and objections.
Well said. So the next few questions that I have, I'm going to request you to take off your author hat and put on your chief economist hat now.
I can do that.
And my first question is, in your role as chief economist, how do you incorporate social issues like second chance hiring into your economic analysis?
So very carefully, of course, but the reality is that the growth potential, the economic growth potential of any economy is defined by two factors and two factors alone. How fast can you grow your workforce and how productive is your workforce? And those are really people issues, and societal issues are related to them. It is not exclusive. When I talk about workforce issues, I don't talk exclusively about second chance. It's often just a mention on one or two slides in a PowerPoint presentation. But I do focus a lot on labor force issues more broadly and making sure employers, which is my typical audience, understand that we can do better in terms of attracting labor. And it includes not just second chance, but older workers in the United States, for instance. More pathways for women and working parents. All of those are critical. Taking advantage where possible of immigration. Many of the people who are coming across the borders through non-traditional means in the U.S. are asylum seekers or refugees. There are pathways to employing that population. We need to do everything. This hole in our labor force is so great. We need to do it all.
Fascinating. So time for two more questions for you. My next question is, from an economic perspective, what are the potential macroeconomic benefits of widespread second chance hiring?
We could simply grow that much faster. And also, if it's widespread enough, we stop wasting money on incarceration and the justice system. It's not going away. There'll always be a need for it, but we don't have to spend as much as we do. In the US, the most direct costs measured are about $90 billion in incarceration. You add sort of court systems and policing, and you get closer to $200 billion. But the real costs are a multiple of that. Probably everything from a family going to visit a relative in prison and needing to take a day off of work and travel for hours that's not money well spent. In terms of what could be the structure of our economy. And then you break this cycle of intergenerational poverty. That I think is the big long-term benefit. It's going to take a generation to do that. I don't pitch that as the rationale for this. The rationale for businesses is it helps you get the best employee for every opening you have. But I would be blind to ignore the really tremendous positive social impacts if this were adopted widely.
That's said. And my last question for you, Jeffrey, how does second chance hiring align with trends in the global economy?
I'm sorry, align with
trends in the global economy.
The U.S. is a little bit of an outlier in the sense that we have an incarceration rate that's unlike any other developed country and large economy. So our contribution of fixing this to the global economy may not be that great because this is simply not as widespread a problem. That being said, I think when you connect this second chance hiring to the broader issue of re-examining labor, you get a lot of benefits for the global economy. I co-authored an article with a Japan economist in the Wall Street Journal last summer and looking at how Japan solved its demographic problems. They went largely to older workers. They changed their immigration laws to allow a larger number of guest workers. They incorporated women in the economy to a degree they had never done before. So I think the lessons of second chance hiring, the fact that you can look beyond your traditional workforce and find talent, I think that has great global implication in a time when global fertility is falling so dramatically.
Well said. Jeffrey, on that note, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to me about your own amazing journey. Thank you for speaking to me about your book, Untapped Talent, How Second Chance Hiring Works for Business and Community. And as you were speaking, I was reminded of a conversation I had with the head of prisons of Delhi about 3 or 4 months ago. And he actually said that they're actively looking for partnering with many business leaders to get their inmates as they're released employed. And he said that it is our responsibility to verify them and we give guarantee for them. I think
That's
all your
wonderful.
comments that you just told me reinforced my own understanding of second chance. Thank you for helping me understand so many of the challenges, and I'm sure my viewers and listeners will really appreciate this opportunity to have heard you. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.